Hey guys, welcome back to Bryan's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail, and today we are going to be discussing a case that I've wanted to do for a long time, mainly because I've watched a bunch of other videos, read a lot of articles about this, and just always bothered me. And this summer I actually had a chance to go out and visit where this actually happened and retrace their steps, which really brought a lot of it into light. So today on Bryan's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail, we are going to be discussing the Boys from Yuba City, and this case happened all the way back in February of 1978. So definitely a long time ago, and it's most likely that the case won't be solved, but I have some energy and positivity that we might be able to figure this one out. So this case centers around 5 young men, all from in and around the Yuba City area of California. And each one of these men did have a psychological disorder of some kind. They had learning disabilities, or they were slow. One of the men we're going to discuss all this in detail, he was schizophrenic, but outside of him, the rest of them just had learning disabilities, or they were, they had a mental handicap of some sort. They were all a part of the Gateway Center, which was a center that worked with people with disabilities, and they all played for the Gateway Gators, which was the basketball team. They were all huge basketball fans. They loved basketball, and they were supposed to play a game of their own on February 25th, part of a tournament, with a free week in Los Angeles if they won. Let's talk about the boys real quick and who they were. Theodore Earl Weir had brown eyes, curly brown hair. He was beer-bellied. He was very friendly in a trusting child sort of way, and he got a chuckle out of sometimes pranking his friend Bill Sterling and reading from newspaper items or, odd names from the telephone book. He was employed for a while as a janitor and a snack bar clerk, but he quit at the urging of his family, who thought Weir was too slow and might have been causing problems. Jackie Charles Hewitt, 24 at the time, 5 foot 9 inches, 160 pounds, had a slight droop to his head, and he was a little slow to respond. He was always in the loving shadow of Weir, who looked after Hewitt in a very protective way. Then there was Jack Anton Madruga, 5 foot 11 inches, 190 pounds. He was a high school graduate and an Army veteran. He was heavy set. He was working as a busboy, but he was laid off the November before by the Sunsweet growers that he was working for. William Lee Sterling, 5 foot 10, 170 pounds, dark brown hair, blue eyes. He was Madruga's special friend. He was deeply religious, would spend hours in the library reading literature, trying to help bring Jesus and the word of the Lord to mental patients that were in the hospital. Gary Dale Matthias, 5 foot 10, 170 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, 25. He was the odd man out. He had schizophrenia. He was an assistant in his stepfather's gardening business. He was also an Army veteran with a psychiatric discharge after drug problems that developed in Germany 5 years prior. So the night of the incident, the boys drove from Yuba City to Chico to see a basketball game, and they were seen at the basketball game, and after the basketball game ended around 10:30 at night, they were beyond excited because their team won. So they were, thrilled, obviously in a state of, celebration. Before they left the game, but before going home, they decided to stop at a market that is in the area of Chico called Bears Market. Now, Bears Market has since closed, but the boys picked up some snacks, some milk, some candy bars, a bunch of little things, and they headed on their way, presumably back to Yuba City. It's important to remember, like I said in the beginning, the next day on February 25th, they were supposed to play in a basketball game of their own, and all of the boys were extremely excited about it. Weir had asked his mother not to wash his new high-top white sneakers for it. Matthias had driven his mother crazy about it, so these boys were all very excited about this game. However, that very cold winter February night in 1978, after leaving Bears Market, they never made it home. That Saturday came and went, and obviously the families were just fulfilled with fear and worry, so they contacted the police, and the police began to take interest the following day, but it wasn't until Tuesday, February 28th, that they found Madruga's Mercury Montego that day, but unfortunately there was nothing and nobody around it. It made no sense, and the car was 70 miles from Chico on a deserted, rut-ravaged mountain road. Here's where a lot of the mystery began. The car was stopped at the snow line, and although its tires had appeared to have spun, it wasn't really stuck, and the police determined that 5 men could have easily pushed it free. The gas tank had about a quarter full tank. There were 4 maps, including one of California, in the glove compartment. The keys were gone, but the police hotwired the car and it started immediately. Both seats in the back were just trashed with food wrappers that they had bought at Bear's Market. Everything had been eaten except for one marathon bar, which was half gone. The underside of the car creates more mystery because it was undamaged. This Montego is a heavy American car with a low-hanging muffler, and they thought that presumably with all the men inside going up this ravaged road, it would have sustained damage. But this is the first mystery that I think I solved, because I drove this myself and I tried to rent a car that was heavy. I put in a bunch of weights in the back. I know it sounds crazy, but the road obviously is in much better shape today. But I could imagine when I was going up it with no snow, I still went really slow because it's a really curvy, dangerous road. And I imagine if the boys had gotten lost and they were going up it and it was snow covered, they were probably going really slow too. And in my opinion, that's really probably why there was no damage to the undercar. And that also kind of rules out the fact that a lot of people have said like, oh, they think that they were being chased up that road. Well, they were, then the car would have gotten damaged. I mean, this is just my opinion, and this is just what I have deduced from actually going to the location and investigating myself. These pictures and videos all here that you've been seeing in the last few minutes, these are all from the area. This is Bucks Lake. Obviously it's the summer, but these are the same roads that the boys would have driven on. The cabin that they were eventually found in, we're going to talk about next, but I wanted to talk about the roads because a lot of people have talked about, you know, the car not being damaged is a big thing, but I think that's pretty much the reason why, is because they were probably driving really slow because they were scared and they didn't know where they were. When looking at this case, we have to keep in mind that the boys were all handicapped in some way, and I imagine if it was late at night and they were stuck on a road that they had never seen before, they were probably scared. Now, the families say that only Madruga drove the car. However, Gary Matthias also did know how to drive, but it is assumed that Madruga was driving the car that night. And he disliked the outdoors, he disliked cold, he disliked camping, and he did not know that road, according to his family. In fact, according to the families, none of the boys knew the road. Bill Sterling had been up there once when he was a kid, maybe 8 years earlier, but you know, they didn't think he would know how to get back up there. And Gary Mathias did have some friends that lived up in the area. We're going to talk about that some more, but it isn't assumed that he hadn't been there. After talking with those friends, they said that he had not been up there in over a year. 3 years prior, Weir had hunted deer with friends in the Feather River country, but it was very west of the area where the car was found, and his family says that he was not keen of hunting or being outdoors either. And none of these boys ever liked staying out late, except for Gary Mathias, which we're going to talk about some more. Unfortunately, the day that the car was found, a huge storm came in and dropped over 9 inches of snow on the mountain. The search teams nearly lost 2 of their own searchers that day. They were using several snowcats that were often getting stuck, and they almost lost one of those too. And even with all that searching, they didn't find anything. Not a piece of clothing, not a person. Nobody found anything until that June 4th, a small group of motorcyclists on a Sunday wandered into a deserted forest trailer camp at the end of the road, and they leaned into a broken window and inhaled a nauseating smell. Sadly, what they were smelling was the deceased body of Ted Weir, who was laid out on the bed inside this 60-foot trailer, and he was frozen to death. There was a total of 8 sheets that had been pulled up over his body and tucked around his head. His leather shoes were off and missing. There was a table right next to the bed, and his nickel ring with Ted engraved on it was there, his gold necklace, his wallet with cash inside, and a gold Waltham watch. Its crystal missing, kind of weird, but the family said that watch didn't belong to any of the 5 men. Weir had been very heavy before this time. Back in the beginning of February, he was around 200 pounds. By the time his body was found, he was only about 100 pounds. He had lost over 80 to 100 pounds. His feet were badly frostbitten, and the growth of his beard on his face is what showed how long he lived. It showed that he had lived to be almost 13 weeks alive in that trailer before freezing to death or dying of gangrene. Now, most of the reports and articles and videos say that this trailer was 19 to 20 miles away from the car, but actually when I went up there, the location is actually only around 10 miles from where the car was. Now, this isn't a huge deal, but it is a discrepancy that I did discover, and I thought I'd mention it. Obviously, the men had walked a great distance in this crazy amount of snow. They had either walked or run, but it was it was a half moon that night, so there was some light, but the snow drifts were 4 to 6 feet deep, so it doesn't matter. Even in 10 miles, in that amount of snow, it is crazy. As you can see in some of these pictures, like with a stop sign with Bucks Lake, the snow is just crazy deep. The investigators that went out had deduced that the trailer had been broken in through a window. There was a broken window, obviously, but there was a lot of oddities. No fire had been built. There was a lot of matches lying around. There were paperback novels, wooden furniture, lots of things that could have been burned easily. More than a dozen sea ration cans from an outside storage shed had been opened and emptied. One had actually been opened with an Army P-38 can opener, which only Madruga and Matthias would have known how to use because they had served in the Army. But no one had opened a locker that was in the same shed containing enough dehydrated Mexican dinners and fruit cocktails, other assorted meals as well, to keep the all 5 alive for over a year. Further oddities, there was a propane tank outside which no one had touched either. All they had to turn on the gas and light it and they would have had heat. The Yuba County Lieutenant Lance Ayers, he ended up heading up the investigation. He had gone to Marysville High School with the Weir brothers, and he just felt a real personal connection to this case, and it actually ended up consuming him. He was just so involved in the case. Once Weir was found, he said they had leads from all over the world. Ontario, the boys had been seen in Tampa, Sacramento, and this guy Ayers had to knock out all these leads. He had to make sure none of them were real, and he actually ended up consulting a psychic because he was so desperate for information. And of course it didn't lead to anything. They said that the psychic said that they had been kidnapped and taken to Arizona or Nevada. The day after Weir's body was discovered, searchers found the remains of Madruga and Sterling. They lay on the opposite sides of the road to the trailer, about 11 miles from the car. Now that is something I couldn't verify. Madruga had been partially eaten by animals and dragged about 10 feet to a stream. He lay face up. His right hand was curled around his watch. Sterling was in a wooden area scattered around 50 feet. There was nothing left of him but bones. Unfortunately, then 2 days later, just off the same road, but much closer to the trailer, Jackie Hewitt's father, yes, his father, found his son's backbone. Ayers, the county officer, had tried to talk him out of joining the search, fearing exactly that something like that would happen, but Hewitt refused and unfortunately ended up finding his own son. Later on, more bones were identified by the family dentist to be the teeth of Jackie Hewitt. Hewitt's remain lay northeast of the trailer, like Sterling's and Madruga's. Northwest of the trailer, about a quarter-mile away, searchers found 3 wool Forest Service blankets and a 2-cell flashlight lying on the side of the road. The flashlight was slightly rusted and had been turned off. It was impossible to tell how long it had been there. They found no sign of Gary Matthias. He remains missing to this day. But some other oddities that surrounded that were his tennis shoes were found inside the forest trailer, which kind of suggested to the other investigators that he might have swapped shoes with Weir, since Weir had the leather shoes and Weir had bigger feet. And when your feet get frostbitten, they tend to swell, so Matthias could have taken his shoes in order to go and get help. At the time, state mental institutions were all given the description of Matthias: slender, dark hair, double vision, without his glasses. He was not carrying his billfold, and he had, left this house to go to this basketball game. Unfortunately, Matthias took medicine on a weekly basis. He took I'm gonna have to spell it, Stelazine, and Cogentin. Both were used to treat his schizophrenia. According to Gary Matthias' family, said that the illness appeared 5 years ago while he was in the army in Germany. Police records also show that he had become violent on occasion. He was charged with assault twice, and there was a difficult period after his return from Germany. when Matthias would fail to take his drugs, lapse into a disoriented psychosis, and then he would usually end up in the Veterans Administration Hospital. That said, according to his family and his doctor, Matthias had been working steadily in his stepfather's business and was taking his medication ritualistically. His mom said that he had not missed a dose, and the doctor said that he was one of their biggest success cases. During the investigation, Special Agent John Thompson of the California Department of Justice joined Ayers in the investigation because they just had thousands of leads. Every day they got thousands of leads. They learned that a Forest Service snowcat had run up the road on February 23rd of that year, leaving a packed path of snow that the boys most likely may have followed. They took on a water witcher from the town called Paradise, who said that he had fixed it so that the driving rod would pick up traces of human minerals, and then led the searchers to a deserted cabin near the abandoned car. They found a gray cigarette lighter, disposable of a plastic kind, about 3/4 miles northwest, but the families of the boys said none of the boys carried a lighter. As I mentioned earlier, they also discovered that Gary Matthias knew people in Forbestown, which is about halfway between Chico and Yuba County, on the road, which is an easy miss during the turnoff, especially late at night, and they might have ended up heading north towards the mountains and gotten lost. But again, none of this proved useful, because when those guys were contacted in Forbestown, they said they hadn't heard from Matthias in years. This leads us to one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in this case. A man by the name of Joseph Shones, 55 years old at the time, told police he drove his Volkswagen Bug up the same road sometime after 5:30 the evening that the boys disappeared. He said that he was checking the snow line because he was to bring his family, wife and daughter, up that weekend to go skiing. However, his car got stuck in the snow just above the snow line, about 50 yards beyond the place where the Mercury Montego would later be found. As Shones was trying to free his car, he said that he had a heart attack. Doctors did later confirm to the investigators that Shones had indeed suffered a mild heart attack. After suffering this attack, Shones lay down in his car with the engine on and the car heater going. Sometime in the night, he said that he was disturbed by whistling noises, and he got out of his car to look, and he saw a group of men with a woman and a baby, he said, walking in the glare of the vehicle's headlights. He thought he heard them talking, and he says that he yelled for help, but then he says that when he did yell for help, the headlights went out. He reported that sometime later he saw flashlight beams outside his window. He again called for help, and the lights went out. Whoever it was, he says they went away. He went back into his car and laid down until it ran out of gas, and while it was still dark, he walked the 8 miles back down to a lodge called Mountain House. On his way, just below his Volkswagen, in the place where he heard the voices, he says that he passed the Mercury Montego sitting empty in the middle of the road. Unfortunately, there's a lot of holes in Shones' stories, and his neighbor reported that he tended to elaborate and make up stories a lot, and also tended to drink a lot. And it's also reported that when people suffer heart attacks, they can hallucinate. And there was another woman in another convenience store that a couple days later had reported seeing a truck with 2 of the boys come in, and then Shones changed his story to say that he saw a truck on the road that night too, which is indicative of someone not telling the truth. I also learned from my research that his model Volkswagen Bug, the heater wouldn't work unless the car engine was turning, unless the car engine was running, like, he was actually moving. The one possibility was that he could have modified it, but according to his neighbors, that this wasn't something that he did or could have done. So I don't know, I find his whole testimony kind of hard to believe. I do believe he was out there and he had the heart attack, but as far as what he saw, his story changed a lot, and I'm just not so sure what we can believe there. So what actually did happen on that cold night of February 24th, 1978? Let's get into the theories and talk a little bit more about some of the details of what happened in this case and what I believe happened, or what could have happened based on the evidence and what I saw when I went out there this summer and investigated myself. One of the main theories that has emerged recently revolves around Gary Mathias, and the Sacramento Bee posted an article a few years back discussing this, and there's no doubt that they went to the basketball game that night. After the game, they stopped at Bears Market, and then somehow they ended up on this windy road. And there are some who believe that Gary Mathias, who was the one that was schizophrenic, so he technically didn't have like a mental handicap, it was a mental illness. But he also had a history of walking over 500 miles to escape one of his mental homes, and he walked all the way home, surviving on garbage and all kinds of things. Now, granted, it wasn't in 6-foot snow drifts, but he did have a history of having violent outbursts. So some believe that he might have gone off his medication and forced the boys up there, and then subsequently killed them all. But I personally don't believe this. I don't deny that he did have a violent past, and he had, bad things in his past, and he did have schizophrenia. But personally, I don't believe this is the case. Personally, what I believe happened is, I believe they went to their basketball game. They were very excited. They had won, their team had won. They were going to be playing in their game the next day. They went to Bears Market, got their snacks as, sort of a celebratory snack. And then, maybe in their excitement, they just lost track of the road and they made a wrong turn. So now they're on this windy, dangerous road, and they might not have realized that they were going the wrong way until they were several miles in. And when they did realize it, they saw the snowcat had just freshly paved the road, or at least plowed some of it. So they followed that, thinking that, because I've been up that road and there's really nothing along it. There's not a lot of houses, and I'm sure there was a lot less, 30 years ago. So they probably followed the tracks, thinking that there was something maybe up there, direction that they were already heading, in the direction that the snowcat had gone. And it's also worth noting that on that road, even now, it's very hard to turn around. And I'm sure that 30 years ago, with 6-foot snow drifts and banks, it was even harder. So it's possible that they just couldn't find a spot to turn around, and when they hit the big snow line, their tires spun. Maybe they turned the car off and got out and tried to push it, and maybe the car wouldn't start when they got back in. Those old Mercury Montegos were not exactly known for their engine worthiness. They were actually known for the opposite. They would often, if they got too cold, they wouldn't turn on. So it's quite plausible that the car wouldn't turn on for them. And I'm guessing they followed the tracks up the snow path, and Gary, Matthias, and Weir were the only ones that made it to the cabin. The other 3 fell behind, and Matthias broke a window to the cabin. They got in there. He got Weir into bed, tucked him in as best he could. He traded shoes with him because his feet were probably swollen, and Weir had the bigger leather shoes. He grabbed the 2 service force blankets and a flashlight and went out back into the wilderness to find his friends and to help them. I'm guessing at some point he became disoriented and lost and realized that he would never be able to find them, possibly, or maybe he had an injury himself, but I don't believe he ever made it back to his friends that night. I believe that's why the investigators later found the 2 blankets and the flashlight. I believe he probably dropped them. And yes, I do think that out of all of them, Gary Matthias is probably the one that could have survived. But I also believe that someone like him, after being off his meds, in society, he would have been, recognized, or he would have done something to draw attention to himself. I think he would have been found. I don't believe he could have remained hidden for all this time. In regards to the rations that were found inside the cabin and why the guys didn't open more, I believe that they didn't open the first ones. I think that the crew that had came up the day before to get the cabin ready for the storm, the guys that had plowed, they had opened up the rations, eaten whatever they wanted, and left whatever else was left. And maybe the guys foraged on what was left, but I don't believe the guys themselves took just a few cans and left the rest. I believe that Matthias and Weir were only in that cabin for a few minutes together. When they got there, Matthias wanted to go out and get his friends. That's why he took the flashlight and blankets, and unfortunately, I believe they all perished in one way or another in those woods. I believe this all started with a wrong turn, and unfortunately, due to the reduced mental capacity of all of them, and the snow being so high, and just a bunch of factors all coming together at once that led to this tragedy. I don't believe that there was any foul play involved. I believe that when they got lost, they were driving very slow because it was a very curvy, snow-filled road. So I think that's why there wasn't any damage to the car. And I think that if they had been being chased up there, there would have been evidence of that, and there would have been damaged. And I think ultimately they just all ended up perishing in those woods. I know it's human nature to want to assign blame, but I truly believe, at least from what I've discovered and what I've learned about this case, I don't believe that there was foul play. I believe that it was just a series of unfortunate events that led to this events happening. Alright guys, that's the end of this video. I want to thank everybody for watching, and I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this case. I know a lot of you are familiar with it, so definitely leave me a comment and let me know what you think happened. And of course, everyone, please be respectful in the comment section, and I will see everybody in the next one. Thank you again for watching, and thank you to all my new subscribers, and thank you to coag.ag for providing the background music. Take care.